Hello, everybody. Welcome to the last session. Is it the last session? Am I right here for today? I have to. Yeah. Yes, it actually is. Welcome everybody to the last session on track 1 on Saturday. Doing this all day, I actually lost my mind a little bit here. But we have one more highlight for you. I'm very happy to have Mathias Lesniak with me for his session about open source and I, freedom, love, and or contribution. Before we get to him and his session, I will quickly remind everybody that it's still possible to register for the event if you want to take part in the chat infrastructure that we provided for the event. You can still do so. You can still register by visiting t3oce.org or by clicking the registration link in the video description. And by doing so, you get the opportunity not only to ask questions in the chat that we will address later after the talk, but also get the opportunity to join the Jitsi call with Mathias to talk to him personally about his talk or about whatever you want. So let me introduce Mathias real quick. He's a Typo 3 Association board member, and more importantly, he is a certified Typo 3 integrator. And not only that, I learned in the in the conversation we had right now that he's also a certified Typo 3 consultant and an editor. So good luck beating that. His day job is at Pixelant, where he works with development, sales, project management, and much more. And today he will be talking about the topic open source and I, freedom, love, and or contribution. And the talk is going to be about open source means taking control over your business critical software, but where does your company and you as an individual belong in an open source community? What is contribution and community really about? And is it necessary? What would the world look like if everything was open source? Let's try to answer these questions with the Typo 3 project as an example. I think that sounds pretty good. This talk, as many others today, is a pre-recorded one. So Mathias is currently, if I understood him correctly, at some pit stop somewhere. But he's in the call, as you can see, and will be answering your questions after we streamed his pre-recorded sessions. So now I would say, without further ado, relax, spam the clap emoji in the chat, give a big round of applause to Mathias, and enjoy the talk.
Hi everyone. Thank you for joining this presentation about open source and I, freedom, love, and contribution. First, a little bit about myself. I am Mathias Lesniak. I live outside of Oslo, Norway, with my wife and 2 kids. I have been working with Typo 3 since 2003, when I crashed my first Typo 3 installation by renaming the Typo 3 directory. I am a member of the Typo 3 Association board, where I'm responsible for communication. I am also not any other Mathias, if you should think so. My normal job is doing Typo 3 at Pixelant. Today, I am representing neither the Typo 3 Association nor Pixelant. I am just me. I am talking to you from my family's holiday house in the mountains just north of the Arctic Circle in Norway. I am going to talk about open source, but it's really about us human beings and about community. This is also the first time that I make this presentation. Strange then that this is a pre-recorded presentation. You won't be able to throw rotten tomatoes in my face, And maybe even worse, I won't know whether or not my jokes work and whether or not you understand what I'm saying. I'm going to take the risk of simplifying some things in this presentation, which means you'll have to forgive me for leaving out the deeper depths and truer truths in some of the things I'm talking about. Luckily, we'll have some time afterwards to talk and for you to ask questions. I'll join you live then to talk after this recording. You might also disagree with some of the things I'm saying. I'm painting in broad strokes and making examples, but it's really just a few very general ideas I'm trying to get across. Having said that, I was considering adding fake laughter to indicate when I was trying to be funny and boop sounds when I wasn't, but this is at least no deliberate situation comedy, so I'll try to save you the pain. But anyway, open source is a lot like a conference presentation, or better, a stand-up gig. If it's bad, people say they could have done it better themselves, and maybe they could. If it's good, the audience will love you, but believe me, it wouldn't have happened without the audience there to play against. Open source works in much the same way. It is a participatory exercise like a dance. It doesn't work well as a solitary game. Although, as a developer, it can sometimes feel like solitude is all you get. Anyway, if it is a dance, it is a rather strange dance though. I think pretty much everyone with an internet connection uses open source software today. However, I bet only a small percentage is aware of the fact that they're using it, and even fewer know what it actually means to use open source software. Therefore, I think it is important for open source that we talk about it. We're pretty good at talking about open source in the Typo3 community. We even put open source into the first few lines of the source code of every Typo3 based website, so we talk about it, we show it. The fact that we put information about open source and licenses into the top of pages tends to raise eyebrows with outsiders, but it is a really powerful statement that we're making. So, compare the first 15 lines of typo3.org with those of, let's say, wordpress.org. And drupal.org. You could probably write a book about just the differences in HTML code here, but I think you'll agree there are other and more interesting differences between the open source tradition of Typo3, Drupal, and WordPress, and of course any other open source CMS. All of these three that I mentioned, Typo3, Drupal, and WordPress, are great examples of open source systems, and I think every community will say it's the best. Still, Typo3 is known for being a community with a flatter structure and fewer paywalls than the others. We also lack an active project founder, and that means we have no grand old man who can formally or informally influence our project. Think about that. A flat structure and fewer commercial extensions don't make the code more or less open, you could say, but there are added dimensions that this gives to the open source project. Building a healthy open source community doesn't happen automatically, and more than constantly propending open source every time we say the word software, I think learning more about what open source actually entails is a key to continuing our community's positive growth. Although open source is widely used and popular, it is still a new paradigm. It requires a different way of thinking. The open source way of thinking is not something you learn in school, unfortunately. In some sense, open source is a system or trade or finance that removes one of the real core foundations of a modern economic system. The exchange or the trade. In return, you build a trust in something not so new, but very valuable. The individual human being's ability to participate and take charge. So, what do I mean here? The exchange is the foundation of money. I have an apple and you have an orange. I want the orange more than the apple, and you want the apple more than the orange. By exchanging them, we both get something we want, something that we find more valuable than what we had. We have both made a profit. Money is just a more flexible medium of that exchange. It is sort of a wild card that can be exchanged against anything that has the right value for you. Your clients, they want a website more than their money. And you would look properly odd if you sat around constantly making new websites only for your own agency and said no to your clients' money. With open source, we do it differently. We just give away stuff. How stupid of us, eh? We could have been millionaires, but it gives us a lot more instead that might, in fact, be much more valuable for us and the world than just money. When you give away Typo 3 code, you use the GPL license, the general public license. That means you're also giving away freedom. Yep, open source doesn't always give away freedom. There are open source systems or systems that call themselves open source out there that are not as open as Typo 3 and as open as the GPL license. That's why what we're doing is often called FOSS, or free and open source software. And yes, it's free as in freedom, not as in cost. No cost, right? However, even cost doesn't mean the same thing here in open source. Maybe you'll have to pay to download the software, but let's think of that as the cost of making the software available, rather than the cost of your copy. Remember, you can redistribute your copy for free as many times as you want after you maybe bought it. However, cost and freedom are more closely related than you might actually realize. Not only does the user have the freedom to see, modify, and redistribute the code, you can also give users freedom from paying you for the product. That is an interesting type of freedom. Well, in any case, payment is not a required part of the transaction, and that is really important. You can compare it to having a friend, which most of you do, help you drive some garden waste to the dump in his pickup. You don't have a pickup, you have a small car or a bike. That's what friends do, right? You might cover the cost of petrol, but you wouldn't pay a friend by the hour, would you? And your friend wouldn't expect anything back. He does it out of love. Yeah, I think you can call this an act of love. Not love as in kissing or marriage and all that. The English language is a bit limited in that way. But by seeing the code as a gift to the world, with no strings attached, you can give the user the ultimate freedom, the freedom to make their own choices. You can always come with high morale and say that everyone should give something back, but moralizing is very close to actually requiring a return payment. And that instantly takes away the freedom. If you accept that open source is an act of giving, and just like in friendship, you shouldn't keep an account of how much the friendship is worth based on the number of favors you've gotten, it is, isn't it? It's like a friendship in a way. Open source wouldn't work if we counted each code redistribution and felt hurt if we weren't paid for it. It would just make a lot of hurt. Still, the system won't work if we don't make sure that the giver can survive. But open source requires a very different approach. Something really special happens when successful open source software projects come online. Open sourcing your project is like casting a magical spell that makes dead things come to life. And no, I don't mean that open source is zombie software or Frankenstein's monster. It's more like the story of Pinocchio or the fairy tale about the gingerbread boy. Do you remember those kind of stories? Have you ever heard them? It's sort of a parent or parents who are wishing to have a child, but they can't have it the usual way. Through some magic, their ersatz that they've created, a wooden puppet or cookie boy, suddenly becomes alive. The same thing will happen with a successful open source project. It gets a life of its own. As you might remember from the fairy tale, the child doesn't only have a life, but also a mind of its own. Open source software projects can do that too. Suddenly, there are other contributors and users with their own thoughts about the software, how it should be. But everyone are all the same, striving towards a common goal, making this piece of software even better. There is no longer a software vendor supplying a product, but an open source community where the roles of buyer and seller no longer really apply. In truth, everyone could make their own version of the software, but the real benefit of open source comes when we collaborate as a community. Imagine, it is like a very unusual dinner party and a definite COVID-19 deal breaker. We're all eating from the same bowl, and the worst thing that could happen is that someone brings a fork. I would have added laughter there. Anyway, running a community is very different from selling a product. Rather than being a lesson in sales, it's a fundamental lesson in democracy. Both in open source and in democracy, making a free choice requires good information. For me, democracy building is one of the most amazing things that the Typo 3 community is contributing to today. And I'm not kidding. When the Typo 3 Community Expansion Committee helps the Rwandan government build Typo 3 expertise, it isn't just spreading Typo 3. This isn't a mission. It is spreading the idea of open source, and it builds a local open source community in Rwanda. Many companies, of course, invest in building technology in developing countries, but even though it's labeled as aid, it comes with the same vendor lock-in and license fees that we see with proprietary and commercial content management systems. With that financial dependence that you get, countries can lose their political independence as well. Because Typo 3 has no profit goal, we can focus freely on building independent local businesses, effectively building local competition for all of our closed source cousins. And by building a collaborative open source community, we also help grow democracy and civil society. That's right. You can get only so far by introducing open source software, plain and simple. You also have to introduce the methods and ideas that support a truly free and open software project. Being a community with a flatter structure than others is also a benefit when working with building democratic institutions. We don't have the idea of a strong leader in the Type 3 community. Rather, we have a strong community that is actively taking part and contributing in the decision-making processes through teams, committees, association elections, contributing code and extensions, or simply helping others learn how to participate. An uninformed user of open source software is kind of living a life of blissful ignorance, you could say. There is nothing wrong about that, but you can build neither democracy nor open source on keeping people ignorant. Open source is a great way to learn about and develop democracy, and one of its core pillars is free speech. In an open source community, we have to dare to talk about what we would like our community to be, what we dislike and what we like. The trick here, though, is to use positive reinforcement. It's a lot easier to say what we're not, what we dislike, but how will that help us? How would it help us to say we're not the WordPress or Drupal communities? It wouldn't help us very much, would it? Those communities, however, have so much good in them that it would be like shutting the door, which is absolutely not the same as being open. Instead, we have to ask what good sides we would like to build and strengthen. And we should also look through other open doors and try to learn from what others do right. Open information and open conversations is a key to growing and prospering our community. A community where users can actively use their freedom to benefit both themselves and the community. Listen, it's a place where they can use their freedom to benefit both themselves and the community. There is one side to the freedom of open source we haven't talked about yet. Just as a citizen in a democracy, the freedom you get must be wielded responsibly. Individual responsibility is also an important pillar of a democracy. It's easy to talk about your rights, but what are your responsibilities? The responsibility, in essence, is to collaborate and make the best decisions for everyone. Freedom with the responsibility doesn't just require you to be informed, but also to be able to see your own role in shaping the world you live in. You can give back to open source in many ways, and nobody can tell you what the best way is for you. Maybe it's not even possible for you to give anything back right now. That has to be an acceptable possibility as well. Still, realizing that you should ask yourself the question and answering the question whether or not to give back and how to do it has to be entirely up to each individual. If you're a free rider now, you might become a great contributor later. Who knows? And who can really judge you? The responsibility we have as a community is to make sure everyone knows how open source works, and that is how trust, freedom, and responsibility is built. Talk about open source. It's not only a fringe concept, and it has the potential to guide the development of a more fair, free, and democratic society, as well as an excellent CMS. Thank you for listening.
Great stuff, by the way. All right, welcome back, everybody. Just get rid of my echoes, so this should be fine now. Well, thank you very much, Mathias, for this great talk. Also, nice background.
Thank you.
But also very interesting topic. So you get to the big buckets, talking about democracy and open source and how it's connected. I'm currently scrolling through the chat, and I fear that we have lost a lot of audience to Benny, who is at this time presenting over at the other track his visions for Typo 3. So this is possibly why we have not many questions in the chat. I have one for you. I asked myself during the talk, what was your inspiration for this? Was it the big Typo 3 project in Rwanda, or does this come from somewhere else?
Well, it actually comes from quite a history I have with thinking about social projects and how you can work in a normal job and at the same time benefit the world. And I was inspired by the work that's been going on in sub-Saharan Africa, and that work is also being expanded. But I also think that it's really important, and I've been thinking about that we need to, not just say that we're open source. We actually have to go out there and tell people what open source is, because it's if you compare Typo 3 or any true free and open source piece of software to anything that you can buy off the shelf, the off the shelf stuff is authoritarian in the essence that it just gives you whatever you get. You can't decide very much about it. And with open source, you actually become a participant. And that participation is something that we as humans today really, really need to exercise, being a part of the world that we live in and actively, well, maybe changing it as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, maybe we should emphasize more on the fact that open source also means participation. That's a very good thought and a very good point. I'm gonna have a look one more time so we see people are clapping for you, which I would do right now if I would not be in the stream here. All right, so I don't see any more questions that I can present to you, which is it's no problem, not bad at all. Maybe we can have a little discussion in this Jitsi call with a few participants of the event. They can join this Jitsi call in a moment. I will post the link in the chat room so that you guys can join. You folks can join. And before that, I will say goodbye to everybody watching the stream on YouTube. We are signing off now, and we'll be back with short closing sessions, I guess. And if that's wrong, then we see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.